Thank you. So, are you able to bring up my, I have some pictures to show. For those who are remote viewers, I'm afraid I won't be screen sharing the pictures which appear here. That's for copyright reasons. There are complicated copyright things about little images which I have. But what I say won't depend on reading the things which are on the screen, and I'll read out anything that's important. So they're just a little extra for the people who are actually physically present. And in the podcast version, there should be some extra links to make so that you can look at archive things for yourself and at more leisure. Well, it's lovely to be able to start off this meeting, and thank you for that introduction, but also a great pleasure to be able to start with the Bank of England's choice of icons for Alan Turing on the £50 note. The £50 note focuses on the design of Alan Turing's automatic computing engine plan of 1946 and its links with his paper on computable numbers, which of course had been published by the London Mathematical Society, pleased to say, in 1936. Now, in 1946, the ACE was a world-leading computer project. I mean, it was the project at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. And Turing was in the news. I mean, he was the news as the originator of this development, and clearly said to be based on his original ideas. But today, Turing's status as the inventor or originator of the computer is a highly contentious, and the first thing I'm going to do is examine that contentious issue. As it happens, almost exactly 75 years ago today, on the 20th of February 1947, Turing gave his own talk to the London Mathematical Society about that project. And it was, in fact, the closest that he ever came to giving his own account of the origin of the computer. And he did so, and importantly, I'll bring out, as a mathematician to a mathematical audience. So I think this is a wonderful place to start. And I also thank the bank for making this connection. And that's a little bit of his typescript I'm showing on the screen, but the crucial words are his opening words. Some years ago, I was researching on what might now be described as an investigation of the theoretical possibilities and limitations of digital computing machines, and then a description of infinite memory on an infinite tape. This was his modest, careful reference back to 1936 and his great work. And of course, it's just what the audience would have expected. It was well known that the ACE in the news was based on his ideas. And that opening section was followed by Turing's very clear explication of the concept of the universal machine, a single special machine of that type that could be made to do the work of all. And then, very importantly, digital computing machines such as the ACE are practical versions of the universal machine. That's the central point. Now, go back a bit. What had Turing done in 1936? Well, first, he gave a definition of computability in terms of machines, which was completely fresh and soon found to be a compelling new idea, and indeed hasn't been superseded. In the course of that paper, Turing defined this concept of a universal machine, which can compute anything that is computable. Now, the universal machine is not essential to his definition of computability, nor indeed to the mathematical proofs concerning the scope of computability which flowed from this paper. But he clearly, I mean, he really enjoyed it. You can see that he liked what he discovered about this universal idea. In section 6 of the paper, the universal computing machine, he used this strange word, it is possible to invent a single machine which can be used to compute anything that's computable. And unusual word for a mathematician to use, invent, a very curious choice. And he liked that. And also, I should mention, it is important that seeing that instructions are themselves a form of data and are stored and manipulated alike on the tape, that is essential to his proof. It's absolutely basic to the whole advance that was made in that paper. So that is crucial. And of course, that really is the essential thing that comes into the nature of digital computers as they were developed in his hands and others after 1946. Now, this definition is buried in section 6 of the paper. It's not its principal theme. The mathematical follow-up to his work in the 1930s was all about his definition of computability and showing the equivalence of that definition to other people's definitions. A lot of enormous amount of interest in that. Now, I don't want to downplay the importance of that topic. One reason being that Turing's fundamental interest in what is a mental state, the operation of the mind, the human computer, is there right from the start. And that's something which really leads on to his interest in machine intelligence, which we'll hear much more about from Stephen Muggleton later this afternoon. But I'll stick with this one thing about the universal machine. Well, I'll stick with it, but there's hardly anything to see. There's nothing to say for a long time, because Turing himself, and no one else either, didn't refer to this in print until 1945. I mean, in no way was this idea well known. People weren't going around saying, this is the paper which has got the idea of a universal machine in it. They were saying, this has got a new definition of the scope of computability and so on, but that they did not emphasize or pick out in any way that maybe some tiny technical reference in mathematical logic, but in no way was this a big subject of the 1930s and early 40s. But then, of course, the war came along. I have to say, 2 weeks ago when I was sketching this, those words tripped off my lips, but I'm afraid in the circumstances today, I feel more sense of dread than of anything else. But anyway, let's go back to Alan Turing, who had at least a good war of ingenious algorithms for digital processes, which we'll hear all about in Dermot Turing's talk later this afternoon. Algorithms, some performed by people, some by physical machines, different machines with different processes, some numerical, some non-numerical, huge range of them, speed, efficiency, paramount, but every new process requiring new engineering. Turing must have seen that a universal machine would obviate all of this and do everything with what we now call software. I mean, essentially what has now happened. And the key new factor being the microsecond speed of electronics, which was then new in digital applications. This began for him in 1942 with the electronic speed up of the first enigma breaking bombs, and then his winter of 1942 to 43 in the United States, from which he came back determined to learn electronics and indeed designed a speech encipherment system, semi-digital, semi-analog, and in the course of that, he talked with his electronic engineer assistant, Don Bailey, about the idea of building a brain, as he had already done when in the United States with Claude Shannon, the great figure of communication theory. And that was the background to his recruitment by the National Physical Laboratory in summer 1945, where he started work in October 1945. It seems, basically obvious to me that Turing not only knew better than anyone else the idea of the universal machine, but also directly grasped not just the idea, you see, but the electronic means and the algorithmic motivation, and then in 1945, the practical opportunities that opened up through government funding as well. But he did not put anything in writing. There is nothing in writing before 1946. And he was picked, there's no question of it, by John von Neumann, whose famous report, the EDVAC report, appeared in June 1945. And there's no question that von Neumann was the first to have a written plan for a digital computer in the modern sense. But of course, that leads on to another question. What did von Neumann get and gain from Turing? And very varied answers to that question, which I will briefly survey and then give some comparatively new light upon. Some people would say von Neumann got everything from Turing. Once you got the idea of the universal machine, that was it. You just, filling it in with electronic design, that's the easy bit. Well, some people say exact opposite. They look at the scheme of Turing's 1936 paper and say it's nothing remotely like the design of the computer at all. Infinite tape with symbols on squares. There's nothing to do with computers that I know. And Turing's hands-on experience, both with algorithms and with electronics, tends to be ignored. I mean, I think the trouble here is that there are just completely different cultures and completely different value judgments going with them. It's not a question of facts. So mathematics, on the whole, to us, its logical principle is at the center of everything, really. And the more abstract the principle is paramount. But at least to some engineers, I mean, it's more like any fool could have an idea. It's making a thing work that counts. And there's no really one way of deciding between these points of view. But what we can look at is von Neumann's relationship with Turing and vice versa. What did von Neumann know of Turing? Well, start with nothing to do with computers for a start, you see. And von Neumann was an extremely wide-ranging mathematician. And the first contact between them was a remote one. It was that Turing read his Foundations of Quantum Mechanics in 1932. I mean, in German, that is. And it was Turing's first serious research reading as a 20-year-old student. So that's how he'd have known von Neumann's name first. Then they would have met in Cambridge in 1935 through Turing's early papers in analysis. Then Turing was at Princeton at the graduate college, technically a graduate student. That's after he'd done his computable numbers work, just to remind people that, and it was at that stage that von Neumann wrote a reference for Turing for a scholarship, which curiously completely omitted mention of the computable numbers paper. However, it does seem that von Neumann knew of that in Turing's second year, and in 1938, he made a postdoc job offer to Turing, which then Turing turned down. I mean, Turing preferred to return to England and indeed volunteered right away for the government code-breaking. And this job, but nothing to do with computers. This would have been in continuous groups, algebra, and topology, and so forth. So this is the background to a new document recently discovered, which can be dated almost certainly at early 1945. And it's lecture notes of von Neumann's, in which he was presenting several topics relevant to computation of real mathematical interest. I mean, these were mathematics lectures. They were about what's interesting in mathematics. And one of these lectures, or part of one of these lectures, was about the Universal Turing Machine. Now, I have to say, as a mathematics talk, it was a very fine overview with a terrific grasp of the concept that Turing had laid out in his paper. But it was entirely about that 1936 paper. It didn't say anything like, now it's our job to turn this into practical reality. It's nothing like that at all. He posed an interesting mathematical question about what might be the smallest universal machine you could make, but again, entirely within the context of Turing's paper, but a very fine overview of it. And from what I've said earlier, you'll see it's remarkable that von Neumann even knew about the universal machine. It's not the main subject of that paper. It wasn't famous for being in that paper. It wasn't famous to anyone. So it's quite striking that he had not only knew of it and read it, but actually clearly had thought about it for himself and worked out the theory for himself and given his own overview and explanation of it in these terms. In fact, I would go a little bit further than that. I think it's quite possible, we'll never know, that Turing had in fact himself explained this discovery to von Neumann in 1938. There must have been some sort of meeting where they went over Turing's CV and what he would be doing as a postdoc in order to make such a suitable application. And even the most formal meeting would have brought up his list of papers, and Turing would have been encouraged to say something about what he had done. I think it's entirely possible that Turing himself, I see in these words, Turing, von Neumann used the words, common sense might say that a universal machine is impossible, but Turing proves that it is possible. And that's mathematical observation. And that's a striking, there's a view of a mathematician, something is counterintuitive, but proved. I think it could well be an echo of Turing saying himself that this is a surprising result. And they're agreeing on this. Indeed, in his 1946 report, Turing said it was a surprising result. And I think they would have agreed on this. But even so, we'll never know if that was the case. I think it's entirely possible. The point is that there's an awful lot of work you have to go into to convert anything based on this idea to something with actual electronic gates, logic gates and storage systems and all sorts of things that von Neumann did indeed work out with his team, just as Turing did on the other side of the Atlantic in his way with a completely different design and his knowledge of electronics or a completely different philosophy of architecture. And so I think to say that von Neumann knew of this and knew of it well doesn't end the question. I mean, there's just another whole question about the relative importance of ideas, abstract ideas, and practical design. And the enigma, I'm saying this is one of the enigmas of 1945. The enigma is not really about facts, but it's about value judgments. Now, what was Turing's, we can ask something else. What did Turing think of this question, which I raised? Of course, he thought of it as a mathematician, and he obviously knew the idea was his idea, but he didn't pick a fight over priority. And if he had ever wanted to make a claim to the origination of this idea, he could hardly have made the terrible mistake that he made in his own 1946 report of actually citing von Neumann's 1945 report, but not his own 1936 paper. I mean, this is basically crazy. Of course, it was a government report. It wasn't a scientific paper. And so the normal rules about citation and precedence and so don't really apply. But nevertheless, he could hardly have better sabotage his own claim to be in the lead with this. Also, in my view, von Neumann really ought to have cited Turing's paper, but that's, again, it was a report. It wasn't a paper in normal sense. So that brings us back to the talk that Turing gave to the LMS in 1947, because that's the main exception to Turing's otherwise extreme reticence over this question and unwillingness to actually be aggressive about it, because he said specifically that all the machines underway at that point were practical versions of the universal machine. And he'd just come back from Princeton. He'd just come back from a transatlantic visit in which he'd been with von Neumann and Goldstein and other people there. And at that point, that was the only project there was. I mean, it was only the NPL and the Princeton. The other, Cambridge and Manchester, had hardly started. In fact, nothing had actually been built at that point. It was still only plans. So Turing was saying that the American advance, led by von Neumann, was in fact a practical version of his universal machine. Well, of course, Anglo-American rivalry, and this point was a tremendous feature. It entered into everything from atomic energy, jets, radar, everything. It was a big, big story all over the place. And so this comparison was in everyone's minds. And there is a bit of an amusing story here. It brings us a bit more to Turing's individuality, which I will be saying more about later on. On Boxing Day 1946, Turing set off for his voyage to America after running a race in his amateur athletic club. And in fact, during this whole period, I just turned back to, I should have moved on. This little snapshot of Turing at Princeton in 1937 at the right here. So this is the Turing that von Neumann knew, if you like. This is the one that he saw. And this is the Turing that a subsection of the British public saw in 1946, not as a mathematician, but as an amateur runner. Now after this meeting, the Evening News sports reporter interviewed him as a feature on an electronic athlete. And because he'd been in the news about the AC, he asked him about, was he the chap, you see? And got from him the statement that the Americans had done the donkey work of developing the computer project. I don't know what von Neumann would have thought of being told he'd done the donkey work, but I think that's the only recorded interview where anyone actually asked Turing this question. And I think that's the only one. And no one else ever seemed to ask it. On the other hand, I think Turing would have perfectly well recognized that it was only the American development that got the NPL project going. I mean, if it hadn't happened, he wouldn't have had the clout to get something like that started. It needed that rivalry and the stimulus of the American project to get the British government going. And it's also a very confused issue anyway, because everyone knew that something new was happening in calculation, and there was a clear advance was being made, but it didn't have a name. The word computer didn't take on its modern meaning for a long time. Turing referred in that talk to machines such as the ACE or practical version of the Universal Machine. It wasn't a name that you could put to what was going on that was in common to all the various developments. Nor did he really pull out the key point of advance, that instructions are themselves a form of data, can be stored and manipulated as such. He used that fact very keenly and saw the advances that would come in, for instance, in programming languages and compilers then acting on those languages and so forth. He saw that, saw a great deal that would happen, but he didn't really pull out the very nub of the principle itself, which made it harder, I think, to make a claim as to where this had come from. Another thing that happened is when there's a lot of talk about Babbage and Lovelace and what they'd done 100 years before with the analytical engine plans. And Turing himself, in my view, quite mistakenly, fell for the idea that they had described a universal machine. But instructions and data are completely different in the analytical engine plan. And that's exactly what Turing has shown you have to supersede, you shouldn't have. Anyway, the fact is that Babbage came to be feted as a great Brit pioneer, whereas Turing's name, well, it faded after 1946 until revived very much later. And I think there are other factors too. I mean, Turing got the idea that instructions have data structure from Gödel's theorem. No question of it, that's where it comes from. Gödel's understanding of the arithmetical nature of proofing. But it's not, once you've got it, it's not actually very hard. You don't need to understand Gödel's theorem to apply the idea. It can come up in other ways. And you don't need that. And in fact, in the 47 talk, Turing very scrupulously claimed no more than there being a very close analogy between 1936 theory and 1946 design. And in his talk then in 47 went on to other mathematical topics, a fundamental view of what digital actually means, then material on subroutines and future programming, and then artificial intelligence, which we'll hear more about later on. And it's an idea rather than the theorem on which the origin of the computer hangs. And I think that's another reason, which springs from our own careful and honest mathematical culture, why Turing spoke very gently and pretty modestly about his own fundamental contribution. And thereafter, well, Turing never published the 1947 talk, nor his subsequent 1948 report on machine intelligence. There was no conference on Turing machines. There was no lectures on programming. He turned down the invitation to go to MIT in 51, turned down Scientific American, turned down a request for a book. And he made very little of what he might have done to make himself a big name. He didn't act like a big name. The 1946 legacy with which I started was largely forgotten. And Newman's 1955 biography of Turing omitted, or rather I'd say falsified, an account of Turing's role in the first computers. I mean, Dermot Turing later on may refer to Newman's rather misleading account of Turing's war work, but in my view, this distortion was even more unfortunate. Anyway, I'm very pleased that the £50 note has put this back at the center where it was and where it belongs. Now, mention of 1955 brings me to the fact of Turing's strange death in 1954, and so a completely other topic, also very contentious, which is nothing to do with mathematics now, or not only secondarily, but I think I found that people are very interested in hearing about, and I hope you will as well. Now, I shall be talking from now on about exactly the same period, 1952 to 54, as Jonathan Dawes will be speaking about, but it will seem a completely different planet. And you may find it hard to put the two things together. But one thing he will certainly make clear is that the mathematical Turing is not finished, nor declining. I mean, that wasn't the problem at all. And I'm sure you'll get that very, very strongly from what he says. And the issue about the lead up to his death is nothing to do with mathematical science, but something of roughly equal importance to him, namely his sexuality. Now, to remind you, I mean, all male homosexual sex was then illegal, and Alan Turing and his partner in crime were arrested on the 7th of February 1952, the day actually that Her Majesty the Queen began her long and glorious reign. Now, the trial and the treatment by implanted estrogen is all well known. I'm not going to go over that. I'll just say one or two things. It wasn't that there was some vindictive act by the establishment or some especially homophobic judge. This was just the law as it was, backed overwhelmingly by public opinion, entirely routine and typical police action that led up to it. The medical treatment, which horrifies people now, was the soft option. It was the modern, progressive, scientific option allowed after 1948. And the key point I'm going to address is not those, but Turing's own complex reaction to these events, evolving over the more than 2 years that ensued between that traumatic arrest and his death. And just to remind you also, Turing had now moved to Manchester University in 1948 and lived out in Wilmslow, Cheshire. And that itself is quite a factor. He was not living in the protective Cambridge environment where his ideas were at home, but in a much more gritty and more ordinary environment of Northern England. But I'm going to start with a new document whose appearance, I believe, was prompted by the Bank of England's interest in this. After Turing's death, his mother, Sarah, had a letter from Hugh Alexander, who took over the enigma stuff from Turing during the war and became scientific director of GCHQ afterwards. And he'd spoken up for Turing at the trial. Sarah Turing heavily redacted it, as we'd say now, i.e. crossed everything out that she could, but it's been unredacted by technology used for medieval palimpsests and whatnot, and some remarkable scientific advance. And under that stuff, Alexander wrote that rightly or wrongly, he himself did not think he had done wrong, and so he would rather have been imprisoned than admit to having done something wrong. And it wasn't obstinacy, he just would not have lied in order to escape, in other words, to escape the full force of the law. Well, repentance at the trial was something that was expected. Now, he's only saying something that was clear anyway, from everything I know, the way he talked to the police and so on, that he pleaded guilty but felt no guilt. But of course, having words out of the horse's mouth had a lot of extra power. Now, what I'm pointing out is this seems a very modern insistence on what we now call sexual identity or orientation. And I've added a signed image here on his surprising use of the modern expression gay man, which is not at all common name. And it was a modern spirit which is much in evidence thereafter. And I'll give one, I'm not going to go over all this, but just as an example of what he was like. Even while he had the estrogen implant inside him, he seized on a pretty classic upper class escape route of going abroad for what was outlawed in England. He somehow got wind of the very early gay rights movement in Scandinavia, took this very seriously and learned Danish and Norwegian, and made a visit to Bergen in Norway in summer 1952. This unfortunately led to more problems at home, and a young man, Kjell Carlsen, turned up at Newcastle intending to visit his home in March 1953. I won't say Turing was unfazed by this. When he was fazed, he called it a crisis, in which Turing complained that there were police all over the country looking for this young man, but he soon brushed it off as a strange business in which he'd foiled what he called the poor sweeties who are out looking for the young man. Now, it must be that this surveillance reflected his special status. He was not like the hundreds and thousands of other gay men prosecuted in this way, but he was the possessor of unique American and British state secrets. In fact, the most surprising thing about all this period is that he was able to carry on as freely as he did. And he was aware of the McCarthyite security scares and purges of that early 50s era. probably when he wrote, "I detest America," in response to a suggestion that he attend a 1953 conference in America. But the point I'm making here is that all of this way of talking was resilient, trenchant, modern, positive, adventurous, reckless even, you might call arrogant and somewhat entitled, but anyway, humorous. And none of that is really in contention. But what is in contention is, well, in that case, if he was so confident, how does that explain his death in June 1954? And that's where the problem is, and that's where I want to add something else. I want to tell you that this resilience and modernity was real, but not the whole story. There's more to see. There's a gap to be filled, and it's a gap which is partly filled by the release since 2016 of letters that Turing's close friend Nicholas Furbank described to me, and which were only revealed after Furbank's death 5 years ago. Now, Nick was a literary character, one of several young friends whom Turing had made in 1948 in his Cambridge year. Now we see from these letters that Turing, after the trial, had two paramount priorities. And they were, one, getting suitable psychotherapy, and two, making a will. And it seems that he started planning his will more than 2 years before his death. And there's a letter which is actually written in French, which means that you may not immediately see what is going on about here, but there are important words here that he was asking Nick to be the executor of his will, and specifically, en cas d'aucun malheur, in case of any trouble. And it was an extraordinary will. It's one that snubbed his brother completely. It lumped his mother in with 4 gay supportive friends and divided his not very large estate between them, and named as executor this Nick Furbank, who was a young gay friend, completely unknown to his family. I mean, this would be quite unusual now, but then it was off the spectrum. And it was clearly, I mean, it's a decisive act. It was not just routine administration. It was a decisive act. It's a contingency plan for death, en cas, in case he wanted it, in case it happened. And he also had a plan for suicide. Another document that's come to light was written in 1954 by Turing's boyfriend from 1948 to 50, Neville Johnson. He wrote to Nick Furbank in 54 after the death and said that Turing once told him that he had a suicide plan before the war. Well, Neville didn't know what this plan was, but I do, because I heard it from Turing's pre-war boyfriend, James Atkins. He had a letter from Turing in 1937, while away in the United States, describing a suicide plan involving an apple and electrical wiring. This made no sense to James at all. I only remembered it because it was so extremely peculiar. Well, it was extremely odd, but it's what occurred in 1954. And the plan, I mean, what is a suicide plan? I mean, its point is, it's a way to disguise it as an accident. And indeed, he enacted just such a dramatic scene, a home chemistry experiment using potassium cyanide solution for electrolytic gold plating. The accident would arise from cyanide getting onto an apple, carelessly eating. Now, this plan was formed, from what I hear, you see, before the apple featured in the famous Disney color film of 1938, which people often refer to. It must have been quite a shock for Turing to see this, as he did in October 38 in Cambridge, with a poisoned apple so vivid. And we know more of this now from another witness who again only came forward comparatively recently in 2011, and that's Alan, right, yes, sorry, I've missed a trick. Here's a little bit of the will and a picture of Nick Furbank later in life, but I want to skip to Alan Garner, who was also a writer later on, but at 1951 was an 17 or 18-year-old schoolboy at Manchester Grammar School, who, this is again typical Turing stuff, went running with Turing in the evenings around Wilmslow. Now, Garner has recalled an intense conversation where they shared their emotional reaction to the famous apple in the film, which Garner had seen when he was 4 or 5. Turing saying it symbolized life and death choice, and young Garner coming in, commenting from his A-level Latin on the Latin words malus for bad and malum for apple. In other words, it was a meeting of minds. It was a funny, really strange moment, which he remembered extremely well. I don't doubt at all that such a plan was alive in Turing's imagination, and also that it was aimed with a specific purpose to allow his mother and anyone else who wished to believe that it was an accident, a kindly motivation. So let's turn now a little bit towards the somewhat snobbish Anglo-Catholic, but well-meaning Sarah Turing. What did she think of this? Well, she certainly knew a lot more about her son than she publicly admitted. The reason I say this is that Princeton University has, and since my book was written, revealed a correspondence that she initiated with the geometer Luther Eisenhardt, who was dean of the graduate college at Princeton in the 1930s. And she wrote him about what to do if some unforeseen emergency should arise involving her son when he went away to Princeton, and how the college could get in contact with her, blah, blah, blah. Real, completely helicopter parent stuff, in which she asked Eisenhardt to say nothing about her anxiety to her son. So this, I remind you, this is the very period of his triumph with computability and the universal machine, and going to the graduate college on the basis of this great work. So to her, he was this fragile plant. Well, she was right. He was. And this is the same period when he wrote to James back in England about being depressed and thinking of suicide and a plan. And he had a good reason why he might be suicidal. He was in love in a hopeless, humiliating way with this very heterosexual fellow graduate student, Morris Price, with very unfortunate events following from it. And let me just put a little bit more in context here. It's not unknown now for young LGBT people to feel very out of it. Very alienated, very isolated, very unsure of what to feel or do, even though there's none of this legal restriction, infinitely more cultural support than today, but nevertheless to feel, to be vulnerable to suicide. Amazement really that anyone could survive in those days, let alone go on and invent the computer and take on Nazi Germany and all the rest of it. Anyway, that's enough of that. But Sarah Turing knew enough to be worried then, and we now have a little snapshot of what happened after the trial. She visited Alan in Wilmslow about once a year, and during her July 1953 visit, Turing reported to Nick, I'll read on a bit because it gives a wonderful picture of what Alan Turing was like as a friend. You'll hear this. We seem to be getting on a good deal better. I have been subjecting her to a good deal of sexual enlightenment, and she seems to have stood up to it very well. There was a rather absurd dream I had the other night, in which I asked Mother's opinion about going to bed with some men. And she said, "Oh, very well, but don't go walking about the place naked like you did before." I think a little vignette, I just want to give one little bit that actually is what he's like and what his friends knew of him, why he was missed so much after his death. Anyway, she saw the chemistry experiment room then. Turing had rigged it up in March 1953 at the same time as the Kiel crisis. He had immediate access to cyanide. He could just take it from the university chemistry department. Now, there's no health and safety in those days. And I think it was, I just think it was all part of his plan that she should associate the chemistry with his childhood and nag him over washing his hands. And if so, it worked perfectly. He knew her very well. Now, what did she really say? In her book, she just said he didn't believe it was suicide. Privately, she said that suicide in 1952, after the arrest and trial, that would have been explicable, but that it made no sense in 1954, 2 years later. That's why it must have been an accident. And I think she probably felt completely justified in her cover-up, that the criminal prosecution was not the courts, had nothing to do with it. And now, this is what I'm coming to, people have a 21st century version of what was actually her theory, that he was so upfront, so positive, so modern, the trial didn't bother him, that there's no explanation for suicide. But this doesn't hold up. Firstly, why the will in that case? He had organized a preparation for death. But also, if he was so confident about his mentality, what was this insistence on psychotherapy? And there's an overarching point here, which sometimes gets missed. It's a common error to say that after 1952, his legal problems are over, as if his sexuality was also finished with. Well, of course, it hadn't gone away. The law hadn't gone away either. The state hadn't gone away. And it was very much the future of his sexual identity that mattered to him in those 2 years. Well, that was what he needed. That's why he found a therapist, Franz Greenbaum, who was a German Jewish exile in Manchester, very interesting figure in his own right, a Jungian, not a Freudian, and unusual for those days in not advocating what we'd now call conversion therapy, which everyone else did. And that would have been the reason for Turing picking on him and praising him as well informed about sexuality. And after a bit, Turing reported things like he's making great strides for really getting at the problem, and told everyone that this is a great experience. But what was the problem to be solved? What did Turing expect from this experience? Well, you may be surprised, in view of what I've said about what I'm coming to next. The estrogen implant was taken out at the Manchester Hospital in April 1953. Oh, quite jolly there, he said. And in the summer of 1953, he planned another European adventure for July in Corfu. And this destination has always rather puzzled me. This was not a gay hangout thing at all. This was a Club Med. It was a precursor of the swinging 60s. But now it makes more sense because he laid out to Nick Fairbank what his plan was of holiday, and you maybe listen carefully. Thus I expect to lie in the sun, talk French and modern Greek, and make love. Though the sex and nationality of the favored ones has yet to be decided. In fact, it is quite possible that this item will be altogether omitted. I want a permanent relationship and might feel inclined to reject anything which of its nature could not be permanent. The sex yet to be decided. I can pull the other one. He seriously suggested that this was on the cards. We might say he was making an experiment to see what would happen in a completely different holiday environment. But this idea of don't know which, it was the fantasy. And I think the plan went out of the window as soon as he hit the beach, from which incidentally, he sent this nice postcard to the Greenbaum family. It's tremendously hot, so one wears bathing things all day. Well, he hadn't changed, and he seems to have found a number of very unpermanent young men on his holiday, and he's been amazingly good at pickups, actually. Now, how is this extraordinary talk consistent with a defiant insistence about his right to gay life? And the reason I think is that in modern terms, what he really wanted was a sort of emergent bisexuality. I mean, he never denied or denigrated or said he wanted to get rid of these same-sex impulses, or he didn't use the word normal to describe what he wanted to be. I mean, it was homo, hetero, as if they're an equal footing. He just hoped for something more. But it was something with no basis in real people or real life. It was literally a dream. What he told Nick Fairbank was this: I had a dream recently indicating rather clearly that I am on the way to becoming hetero, though I don't accept it with much enthusiasm, either awake or in the dream. Oh, yeah, it's such a gay way of talking it is. I mean, my dear, just so dreary. Anyway, of course, that was, obviously hoped something new would emerge. And he wrote and spoke to his friend Robin Gandy, his logic student, but also close friend, in a similar way. I'm getting slightly hetero, but it's fearfully dull. Robin, in contrast, Robin had always been extremely supportive of him, and he encouraged this way of talking. I mean, that was his way of talking too. And for him, it was a positive development. Nick Furback, I think, didn't like the sound of it at all. He was much more embedded in gay identity, like Ian Forster, whose biographer he became. And to me, hinting at this stuff in 1977, he described Turing as very mixed up, which I think is true. I mean, I think this is a deep conflict. I mean, in a way, you see, he wanted to be dull. He wanted to be more ordinary and less of a complete outlier. And this contradiction, he wanted to be uniquely individual, yet also more ordinary. And this contradiction runs through everything. I mean, it runs through his not wishing to be Mr. Computer of the world, and that it affects his whole attitude to the in question of the invention of the computer. He did not push himself as Mr. Big or Mr. Special, but you can argue about that, but it's a dynamic in him, which is, I think, important. Well, I think I better come to a close here, but I want to point out just briefly that this may sound, I've made fun of Turing's ambition here, but of course it was just a common viewpoint. This is what men should be doing. You might go off the rails in your teens and 20s, but at 40 you should settle down. Lots of people did settle down, like Maynard Keynes, who was a parallel figure, married at 40. After a very extensive gay life, he was at King's. Actually, he interviewed Turing before Turing's fellowship election. And I can't resist mentioning that Keynes admired Turing's fingernails. That was the main outcome of the interview. Well, no, he admired Turing's level of thought very much, but he also admired his fingernails and declared that the quality of his fingernails, the applicant's fingernails, made an infallible guide to the election process. And that remark was made to Lydia Lepakova, who he'd married late in life in just this way. I shouldn't think Turing ever knew that, nor did he know that his enigma code-breaking mentor, Dilwyn Knox, had actually been Keynes's first boyfriend. He knew much more about his pre-war buddy, Fred Clayton, of the late 30s period. I mean, their friendship was based on shared sexuality, or anxiety about sexuality, more like, but Fred likewise had gone through a rather amazing sequence of events to marry, and Turing visited him and his new family in Exeter at Christmas 1953. This model was all around him. I mean, it's what people did. Even the elite King's College people, this is what they did. Not everyone. And G.H. Hardy, whose room we were in, didn't, but there we are. But anyway, Turing himself had tried this in 1941. And with the proposal to Joan Clarke, his co-worker in the naval enigma, which he then essentially withdrew immediately by saying he had homosexual tendencies, it might not work out, after which he was doomed. So that's typical of him, that he was honest about that. And again, it was a modernity. It was a modern approach because he had to find authentic desire within himself. He couldn't just go through the motions of a social process. It had to be something that really flowed from himself. And it was actually genuine. My conclusion is that he hoped that this would be the outcome of this psychotherapy, in which the analysis of dreams was thought to be terribly important, that somehow this would come through and make him give a genuine impetus to what would be a much less lonely and more settled life. I think he may have varied a lot about whether he thought this was possible or whether he thought it was completely doomed, and we'll never know. But I do think he was in a very, very vulnerable situation, a pioneer of life sciences, as Jonathan will say so much about later on, but living a life without life. I mean, a dead-end life. It would have felt like indeed a very lonely life. He never saw enough of his helpful and thoughtful friends. He was too isolated in Wilmslow, and there's no knowing what might have triggered it on that gloomy Whit Monday holiday evening. But I think that this ambition, impossible ambition, was clearly well attested by these remarks of his, was an enormous factor in it. For each man kills the thing he loves, he had sent to Joan Clarke when breaking off the engagement in 1941, and I think he did so again in 1954. So I've come to a rather depressing conclusion. I think Nick Furbank was actually warning me about this in 1977, and I didn't perhaps listen to everything he said. This is not a heroic story. It's a story of its time, of Alan Turing in the social world, the political world, cultural world that he was in. Individuality can't conquer the entire world. It might have been very impulsive. If you'd gone on a little bit more, everything might have seemed brighter. It might have been light in the tunnel. And in that case, of course, everything today would be extremely different. And let's, however, make the most of what we're going to find out about the amazing life that he did have in just those 41 years. So thank you very much.